All right. Well, welcome to episode 8 of A Lesson Before Writing. I actually had to check our website to remind myself what number we were on, which I guess is a good sign. It means that we're getting quite a back catalog of episodes, or I'm just getting older and can't remember very well. But it is episode 8. I'm Ted Morrissey, and here with my co hosts, Brady Harrison. And I'll just kind of quickly plug Brady's most recent book, The Term Between, winner of the High Plains Book Award, which is very cool. And we're working on Brady's novel, which I hope to touch on a little bit at least in this episode. And then also here with Grant Tracy, and this is Grant's most recent release, Neon Kiss, a Hayden Fuller mystery. It's now out in paperback. All our books are available in beautiful hardcover editions, if I say so myself. But Grant's book is out in paperback. It has the introduction that Grant wrote for the hardcover edition, but it also has a preview of the new Hayden Fuller mystery, A Shoeshine Kill. The first section of that is in the back of this book, and that's I think a really great way to end, because it really is a page turner, and so we've got that coming out later this year. And then I'll, plug myself here, Delta of Cassiopeia, and this is a collection of stories and sonnets. Won the Maine Crest Media Award lately, and got some finalists and some other, kind of independent press awards. So that's very cool. And here we are. As I was telling these guys before we hit record, thank goodness 2024 is a leap year, because we're just barely getting our February episode taped in February. But it's been a really busy month. And for one thing, Grant went to the AWP conference earlier in the month. And then I went to the Louisville conference just last week. So I thought, among other things, we might kind of touch on those. So maybe I'll just toss it to Grant and get maybe a little report on AWP in Kansas City earlier this month.
Oh, it was great. Pretty exciting. I think there were maybe 10,000 people trafficked through. At least that's the rumors I heard. It was pretty crowded. The most exciting thing for me is getting to see writers that I've published, and they come by the table to say thank you and to say hello. And I saw a writer I've published several times, Robert McBurty, whose work I really admire. He won a Pushcart Prize years ago for a story called The Dishwasher. And so we just shot the breeze for a while, and that was great. And then a young writer from NYU, Zoe Briscoe, came by, and I just recently published a story of hers. Like, she's pretty early in her career. And there were all these fellow students from NYU that came by with her. And so that was like super cool just to see that level of excitement. It reminded me of myself back when I was in my 20s, So that was, I don't know how old she is. Maybe she's older than that. I don't know. But it just reminded me of being in my 20s. And I was like, I don't know, just that's the most exciting part of it to me, is just getting that thank you from people I published. And I went around the tables and saw editors who published my work and thanked them. And saw Michael Martone. He was doing a book signing and got a book of his. Saw Christine Sneed, who my daughter worked with at Regis, and bought a book of hers, and I got it signed. She was doing a book signing, and so that was pretty cool. So got to touch. Oh, my daughter went. Elizabeth. She's an up and coming writer, and this was her first AWP. So that was pretty exciting to kind of get to be there with my daughter, and seeing her experience. She was going to all these sessions. Me, I'm too cool for that. Been there, done that. So actually, the sessions I wanted to go to were too early. That was my travel day, and I couldn't get to them on time. But she went to all kinds of sessions and after hour readings at bars. There's all kinds of activities late night. And she did a lot of that stuff, and she had a blast. So I was tickled to see her having so much fun. So that was great.
Cool. I've been to AWP a couple of times. The last 2 times it was in Chicago, I went, and I really thought long and hard about going to this conference and having a table for 12 Winters and all that. But it was just a couple of weeks before the Louisville conference, which I was slated to go to, and then my wife was going to be out of town that week too. So then we had the added expense of like dog sitters. So anyway, it just didn't work out very well. But AWP is it is a high energy, and on the other side of the coin, kind of energy sapping kind of
Yes.
conference. I don't mean that as a put down. It's just there's just so much mental simulation, and like you said, and if you want to, you can pretty much go 24/7 around the clock. I learned I have to kind of pace myself a little bit, and so it can be kind of I found it's kind of the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. On the one hand, it can be very energizing, and like you said, you connect with other writers and meet new people. And I'm still like social media friends with people I met at previous AWP conferences, and that's great. But at the same time, it also kind of puts in perspective why it's so hard to get people to read your book, because there are so many great writers and great books and great presses publishing stuff all the time. So if you look at it from the wrong angle, it can actually be kind of a little depressing. Do you have any kind of thoughts on any of that, Grant? Or obviously, Brady, I want you to be able to jump in here too.
Yeah, that's interesting, Ted. I've had that experience in the past. I haven't gone to that many AWPs because of the very thing you described. My first one was in Palm Springs over 20 years ago. I went to the one in Minneapolis. I went to the one in Denver. And I went in with low expectations this time. Like I knew I had an hour long book signing thing, and I figured if I move 2 to 3 books, I'll be happy. I moved 2 books. I'm happy. I said, so I just had low expectations, because it's like, I think I maybe mentioned this on another podcast, or maybe I mentioned it to my students, but there's that famous scene in The Third Man where Orson and Joseph Cotton are up in this ride, and Orson looks down and he says, "You see all those little dots down there? Would you really miss any of them if they just disappeared?" And he's talking about how much money they're worth, and tax-free, dear boy, tax-free. And that's the way I feel at AWP. Thousands of, like, you feel a little bit insignificant. I mean, I don't feel relevant when I'm around. But so I went in there this time, like, without trying to think about that. I'm just gonna have a good time, gonna connect with people. And so it was a good time. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying. Actually the highlight, and the AWP organizers might not be happy to hear this, but the highlight for me was I took 3 of my students that we'd taken, and we went to the Negro League Museum in Kansas City, which sort of took an afternoon off, and they had a great time experiencing that experience. And I got myself a Satchel Paige Kansas City Monarchs jersey, which number 25. It's fantastic, white with red embroidery, and that was, like, for me, the highlight was, I've always wanted to go to that museum, and I finally got to go, and it was free because it's February and Black History Month. And so I gave a donation, but the Kansas City Royals were sponsoring kind of they were paying for it so people could go free, which I thought was great. So it was that was fantastic. And then they had this wonderful display with statues, and it's like the diamond, and you can go stand. So I stood next to a statue of Cool Papa Bell and Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and Buck Leonard. It was good stuff. So that for me was, I'm a big baseball fan. Hockey's number 1, baseball's number 2, but it was fantastic. So that was
Cool.
that was great. And just to see that my students, because we had talked about the statue that got desecrated in Wichita, the Jackie Robinson statue, and so I wanted to make an extra point of taking some students to that museum while we were there, and it was fantastic.
Cool. Now, Brady, I know you and I talked about going to AWP this year. I think we both thought long and hard about it, but I know you have added professional responsibilities, and it's hard to get away. Have you been to AWP before, or what are kind of your thoughts on that whole scene?
Uh, well, no, I have not been, but I think we should all go next year. And I think we should go to promote 12 Winters. And I will put on my rhino hide, Grant,
Yeah.
before we go. It's one of the great pleasures of teaching at the University of Montana is we have such a sterling, such a spectacular creative writing program. And so a number of the grad students go each year to AWP. And so I think it's wonderful for them for the reasons that you both described. They seem to gain so much energy, so much excitement, and see the possibilities and connections and presses and agents and the whole world. This year, unfortunately, several of them came home ill, so it was an exercise in germ warfare as well as many other things. So yeah, yeah, I think we should, I think we should go next year. We had such a blast in Albuquerque. I think we should take the show on the road and see what happens. See who we can see.
I forgot to mention that I got COVID for the first time, and it was from AWP, baby. And that's the only thing I can figure out. I mean, I go down there, I come back, and yeah, tested positive for the big COVID. Had chills for 2 days. It's the worst. I still got a little bit of a foggy brain. So, but I tested negative yesterday for the first time, so I'm mask free. Hooray! But yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, that was one of the benefits of going was catching COVID. So I'm one of the victims of germ warfare.
As you guys know, I came down with COVID for the first time in August after I'd been to Mexico for a week or so, and I was the same deal. I had 2 or 3 days where I felt really bad and blah 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 blah, but I seemed to get over it fairly quickly. But I write every morning, and I hit a stretch where I just wasn't writing very well. I was just not feeling very creative, and I was actually starting to think, "Am I losing it? I mean, I'm going to turn 62 at my next birthday. Am I on that downward slide?" And then I don't know, around November, I realized, you know what? I'm kind of back to writing pretty well from my perspective in terms of feeling creative and doing interesting stuff with language. At least I find it interesting. And so then I kind of had this epiphany. Oh my gosh, I bet I kind of had COVID brain for a couple of months, and I never really connected the dots. But I think it's a real thing. I know you kind of joked about it, Grant. Are you feeling a little dull witted after your?
Yes, I was at the library the other day, and a student of mine who's in a class this semester started talking to me, and I started going on and on about how I caught COVID, and like afterwards, I'm like, he already knows that because he's in my class, and I just didn't quite register, didn't recognize. It was like totally embarrassing, So yes, and I've been working on my new novel, Artifacts, starring the great Hayden Fuller with Eddie Sands. I mean, so it's like I finally put two of my favorite characters together, and I finally figured out Eddie Sands is kind of a Sam Spade kind of guy, and Hayden's more in the Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe category. But anyway, and I'm writing yesterday. I'm like, this is absolute shit. Like, this sucks. Where's my head at? So yeah, I think I have a little bit of that going on. So I'm a little bit, wary of what I've been writing right now. I don't think it's as strong as it needs to be. So
Right.
hopefully this will clear in a few weeks. But yeah, I kind of like some of the choices I'm making, but the language isn't as good. Like I can tell it's not up to my usual standards.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and if you go back and listen to like our podcast from like September and October, there's a bunch of times where I referred to one of you guys by the wrong name. I'm obviously talking to Grant, and I use the name Brady, and I don't. But the thing is, at the time in my head, I heard the right name, and it wasn't until I went back later and listened to it, it's like, oh my God, I was, I was just blithering on there. So, again, so I think it's all related to that. So it's kind of scary, but
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
Um, so I went, like I said, I went to the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture, which is at the University of Louisville every February. And I was telling Brady before we hit record that I think I've been almost every year for the past 20 years. So I've been pretty regular there. And I, of course, did a paper on my guy William Gass here, the Gass Centenary this year. And but I always find it really interesting. There's both a critical element. I mean, there are panels that have like literary scholarship, or it could be other kinds of scholarship. Sometimes there are film papers and other things like that. And then I also do a creative panel. So this time I did my gas paper, and then I read the sonnet cycle out of Delta of Cassiopeia. And I told the poets I was with in that reading that I felt a little bit awkward because I'm really used to reading my fiction in public. But then I think this is the first time I've ever live read my poetry, and it was a different. I almost felt like an imposter or something among these hardcore poets or whatever. But it all went pretty well. I went to a great panel on the beats, which I know
Oh,
Grant, you would have really gotten into. One of the papers was about the fact, I don't even know if you know this, that Jack Kerouac had been hired, commissioned, whatever the right verb is, to start an anthology, actually a literary magazine called the Beat Anthology. And he had the whole first issue assembled. It had all these great beat writers that he was going to represent in this. I think it's going to be like a monthly journal, which sounds awfully ambitious given Kerouac's kind of approach to life. But then before it could be published, the publisher, and I forget which, sold the project to another publisher who didn't care for Kerouac or the beats at all and seemed to
oh,
squash the whole thing. But the scholar that was presenting the paper, who's a beat scholar, obviously, he says, he's got this information. He knows exactly what was supposed to be in it, the authors and what their contributions were. But as far as he's been trying to track down the actual manuscripts, but
oh.
he can't track them down. But I had never heard of that, and I'm pretty into the beats and have studied that quite a bit. And I'm getting the sense, Grant, you weren't aware of that either.
No, and that sounds like if this fella can find out what that is, that would be an awesome like book to publish. I mean, I would buy that book. You know what I'm saying? Like that would be the lost issue of whatever the journal would have been called, and that would be super cool if he could
Yeah.
track down all the manuscripts.
Well, he's a newly minted PhD, so he's got lots of energy, and so I'm
Uh,
hoping he comes up with it because I think that would be
well, I could
super
totally see it.
cool.
An academic book, and you'd have the critical introduction and then each piece, and wow, that would be something. I mean, yeah, I'd be all, I'd buy several copies, stocking stuffers for next Christmas.
There you, there you go. There you go. It's another observation I had was that it seems to be a real aging profession, literary scholarship. And what I mean by that is, we know that a lot of universities are shutting down their programs. They're cutting back their programs, and some of the sessions that were kind of plenary, full group kinds of things, it almost looked like bingo night at the retirement center. I mean, all these. I mean, I felt like the youngest, hippest guy in the room, which doesn't happen very often. But it's kind of a sad thing. You've seen all these scholars that you've known for years and years and years, and they're really in the twilight of their career. And like I said, I met that new beat scholar, brand new PhD, and I met some grad students who are working on stuff. But by and large, a very seasoned group of scholars. So I don't know, like in 5 or 10 years, what the demographic is going to be. I don't know, Brady, you're like I said, big research institution. Do you get a sense of kind of the aging, phenomenon in terms of literary scholars and who's doing the work and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the good fortune over the years to belong to some, really incredible, really energetic, really smart professional organizations. The Society for the Study of Short Story, the Western Literature Association, and the Western Literature Association, focused on Western U.S. writing. They do a lot to cultivate and to bring into the professional realm and to bring to the conference graduate students and then newly minted PhDs and newly hired folks. But you certainly notice that thinning of the ranks at the younger ages. As Grant likes to remind me of, at a Research One university, when I started here in Montana, we had over 20 literature faculty. Now we're down to 6.
Wow.
And the prospects of hiring new young folks is always a challenge. So yeah, there's the humanities have changed dramatically in the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't want to be that dinosaur in the room. It's just, you talk about rhino hide. I feel like a dinosaur. And part of it is, I think there was a penalty to be paid by deconstructing the canon. And I think I mean, I was all for canon busting because I was in the comic books and film, and I wanted that to be part of the curriculum. And so I am just as guilty as anyone else wanting to blow the thing up. But now looking back, you don't need to study Chaucer, Milton, and Shakespeare and all this stuff and to get a degree. I've just seen if you look at programs across the country, so why do we need that kind of faculty? People want to take creative writing classes and classes in editing and rhetoric and that kind of stuff. It just, like, to me, we've kind of, maybe I'm wrong about this, but part of it is financial. People don't want to pay a lot of money to get an education, to get an English degree. That's part of the problem, and we need to somehow change that and make it marketable again, or like, this is a worthwhile degree. But I think there's sort of this whole anti getting an English degree thing, so the numbers are down. But I also think it's, the faculty are down because you don't need to fill those courses anymore. At least that's sort of my impression. And so something has been lost by deconstructing the canon, which at the time I thought was a great idea. And now I'm like, oh, well, there's a price to be paid. And maybe this is it. I don't know. It's just, it's one.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on. I mean, there's a strong current always in American culture of anti-intellectualism and anti-education, anti-ideas. And so I think that's at play. I think the skyrocketing costs of education, the shifting of the understanding of education as a collective good to an individual good. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why there's been a decline in the humanities and in the study of English. But I do see a lot of good energy as well. And one of the things I like in particular to say about the program that I work in is that our courses and our programs in creative writing and teacher education, literature, Irish studies, they're all highly integrated. And the notion is, if you want to be a good writer, you need to read.
Oh yeah.
Remember that idea? You should read all the time. And that energy I see in my department, and still I think I see that conviction in the students. So I'm not without hope, even as it's a battered profession, for sure.
Right. One of the things I wanted to kind of touch on in this episode is this whole idea of artificial intelligence, and there were some panels having to do with that at Louisville. I didn't end up going to them just because you can't go to everything, but it's definitely something I'm very interested in. I think we're all kind of interested. And in terms of what this particular thread of the conversation, it's getting so good, AI, in terms of generating text, that as an English teacher, I spent 38 years teaching high school English, and then I was part of a first-year writing program as an adjunct for a number of years, and so on. And the rationale was always, okay, fine, we're not turning everyone into Joyce, but we've got all these people who are going into business, and they're going into medicine, and they're going into social work, and they're going to have to write, reports, and they're going to have to write letters, and then it was emails, and so forth. So the justification to teach writing, not creative writing, but like, expository writing, was that all these people who are getting college degrees, almost regardless of what profession they're going into, they're going to be able to have to communicate, to some degree in written form. I don't know if that's true anymore. I think a lot of that kind of thing is going to be generated, through AI. I was talking to a woman I know who's a nurse, I don't know, a couple months ago, and she was talking about how when she's on duty, she doesn't really have to write anything when she goes into a patient's room or checks somebody in or something. She's got, on the basically, iPad kind of thing, just kind of a checklist. She just goes through and checks, this symptom and this, that, the other. There's very little writing to do whatsoever. So I'm a little bit concerned that, somebody's going to realize, what, I don't know that we need to teach first year composition anymore, because people who are not going into English, people who are not going into, literary or creative fields, creative writing fields, what do they need to know, to write, a decent business letter or a decent reply to a customer or something like that. I don't know. Do you all get that sense too, that maybe that kind of writing is going to be taken out of our hands as well?
Well, I think it's we'll jump in over Grant, but yeah, I think the verdict is out yet. I think we're only just beginning to grapple with all of the implications. But I can see, yeah, freshman comp, the world changing, and one of the conversations that we have a lot, and one of the issues that you keep reading about, is the amount of how much work are we grading that has been generated by AI, and that we can't rather any more easily tell that it's computer generated. And then so, for us, is the world going to need or want creative writers, storytellers, when machines can generate endless quantities? So yeah, I think it all has to be sorted out yet.
Yeah,
I'm not optimistic.
I guess I'm a little more optimistic. I mean, I think AI can be a tool, just like a calculator's a tool for somebody working in math or whatever. But I'm teaching a comp class this semester, and the main thing I keep pushing is I want them to discover their authentic voice, whatever that voice might be. And so I'm really encouraging the I in writing. I remember when I was writing critical papers, you were supposed to take yourself out of it, and I'm trying to put the self back in there to get them so that it's their voice, not some sort of computer generated thing. So the I say, it's like really important to me, and I guess that's what I'm trying to work in to the comp class I'm doing. But yeah, it's hard to tell. And as a writer, it worries me that I know Shakespeare borrowed other plots and wrote these great plays, but for me, a guy who's really big on plot, I refuse. I will not be anybody's fool. I'm quoting The Godfather here. I am not going to ever use AI to generate a plot for a crime story I'm writing. Like, to me, that's beyond the pale. But I could see other people doing that. Like, oh, I'll just plug in. I got an idea. I don't know where to go with this story. Oh, here's a plot, and now I can write the words. I can make it my own, but the plot was generated somewhere else, and that to me is criminal. But that's my thinking because I privilege plot. It's very high in my aesthetic taste. So, whereas I know like Jim Thompson, who's a great writer, one of my favorite writers, he was handed plots. Gold medal would say, here's your plot, Jim, write the novel. And then he'd write the novel. And so there was one year he published 4 novels and the plots were all handed to him. But, he's astounding because he was doing sort of postmodern stuff in the 50s. So anyway, I'm prattling on here, but my concern is I want to keep it authentic. I don't want to lose myself in the work. And I can't tell, honestly, if it's computer generated or not. I know people early on were saying, oh, yeah, because you'll see big mistakes like someone referring to Stephen King as Stephen Prince because, the computer system got the name wrong, which happens. And my wife does a lot of stuff with it, like to plan lecture notes. She'll find and then she'll incorporate what they suggest with her own ideas. And she'll find constantly that they get plots to famous novels wrong. AI does, so it's not a perfect system, but I don't know. I'm glad I'm retiring soon. Let me just put it that way.
Well, in the publishing world, couple of things here. I've noticed as I've been sending stories to journals for the last few months, increasingly, when you go to the submittable form or whatever form, one of the questions is, did you use AI to generate this story? And you have to kind of take a pledge that you didn't, or let them know that you did, or whatever. I don't do that right now with 12 Winters Journal, although maybe I should. And then related to that, I publish our hardcover editions through Ingram, but our paperback editions, I go through KDP, which is correct, Kindle Direct Publishing, in other words, Amazon. And for the last several months, I've noticed that they have an added element when you're uploading the files and you're doing all the metadata for the book. They ask you, if you used AI to generate the book or any part of the book, or something like that. And so that's been a thing for a while. Now, I don't know if you say, yeah, it's AI generated, if bells and whistles go off or something happens. I've never done that. And then the last thing I'll add is, I'm working on getting my novel kind of out, and Brady's novel is about a third typeset. And obviously, Grant, we'll be working on your new novel shortly. For the first time, I added on the Verso page of my novel that's going to be coming out, and I think I'll do it with Brady's and with yours when I'm working on it, is adding a little disclaimer and saying that no AI was used, in the composing or writing of this book or whatever. And I think we're at a point where that needs to be said. It can't just be assumed that people are, that books are completely biologically, organically produced. And maybe we'll reach a point where there will be some people who only want to read. I'm a librarian too. Maybe one day there'll be a section organically, written books and artificially written books, and so on. I don't know where we're going, but I really felt the need to make that statement in the book right up front.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ted. I'm glad that you'll do that. I've read some things. I read a long editorial by Noam Chomsky that that machines will never be human. Lack certain, but who knows?
Yeah.
It's for us. It's in its infancy, and so we don't know what the world's going to look like. I mean, I know for a fact that I have read AI generated papers. There's no question in submitted for grading. So it's here to stay. that much is certain.
Yeah. I actually, because I'm on the, oh gosh, I'm on the, what do you call it? The council that looks at people trying to get into our grad program. And there's been a couple of papers a couple of student samples that I've suspected, I can't prove, but I've suspected were AI, like the voice suddenly changes. It sounds like a bland Wikipedia page all of a sudden. And I'm like, the voice is different here. And especially I think for us writers, we're kind of in tune to that, to those modulations and tone that we can spot them, but we can't always prove it. So I can't go accusing people of this, but I look on the page and I'm like, this ain't computing with what I'm seeing here and here, So
Well, as you guys know, I don't think I've mentioned it in a podcast, but I had my first experience with a student, a creative writing student, who was using AI to generate their poetry. And that is particularly hard to spot because, I mean, some of this postmodern language poetry, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense anyway in terms of a conscious sort of, ability to sort of paraphrase what it's about. It's kind of about images and so forth. And it reminded me, years and years ago, one of the colleges I adjunct taught for here in town had a sister university in China. And so every semester there would be a big group of Chinese students who would come to Springfield and attend our college, and we would send a big group of American students to China for a semester. It was a great, great thing. But at the time I was teaching kind of introductory creative writing, and we kind of did, full gamut. We did, story writing, we did poetry. boy, the story writing, the Chinese students really struggled with, as you can imagine, trying to get the English syntax correct and just have everything make sense. But when we got to poetry, they were writing some just amazing poems. I mean, I think part of it was sort of the Asian tradition of the haiku and tanka, which I know are Japanese forms, not Chinese. But there is this idea of imagery and emphasis on imagery, I guess I should say. And I don't know that these Chinese students were necessarily completely understanding what they were generating, because they were using their translators, to help them. But it was some pretty fabulous poetry. And if I didn't know that they really struggled with conversational English, and it was probably, kind of synthetically generated in large part, I just would assumed it was just some really terrific image-based kind of postmodern poetry of some sort. So I think poetry is particularly tricky to get a handle on in terms of what's generating it and how authentic is it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That said, I always marvel at people who are bilingual. I'm the typical, ugly American monoglot, and so anybody who can even attempt a second language. I met a friend of mine at the Louisville conference who's from Vietnam, and she always apologizes for her English not being as good as she would like it to be. It's like, don't worry. I mean, I really admire you. I say your English is always going to be miles beyond my Vietnamese. So I totally respect even attempting to converse. I can't imagine going to a high level literary conference in a language that is not my mother tongue, and trying to kind of make sense of it and converse in it and so forth. So I really admire, anyone who has, multiple languages or just two languages even that they can kind of tap into. Now, Brady, are you French fluent?
Oh, no, no, I wouldn't say that. I can get by. Had the good fortune to live in France, and I listened to in the old days when I would drive around CDs. Now it's all on a thumb drive, but I still work on my French all the time. I've never given up. I don't know, because we were talking, Grant mentioned his daughter. I wonder if I could share a bit of good news. And I say this, and the segue is my daughter's actually trilingual, and so I officially hate her in that regard. And we've had really great conversations. And I know this is going sideways and digressive. I'm teaching Tristram Shandy right now, so I'm allowed to digress and go.
Yes.
If there's a point, we'll never get to it. But my daughter and I've had, lovely conversations, and I listen closely. And when I have lived in France, and when I've traveled and stayed, for a month at a time or something in France, I find that my cognitive experience changes a little bit. And she says that you think differently in different languages, and you dream differently. And I find that kind of fascinating. It sort of changes who you are. Anyway, so I'm talking about my daughter, because what I want to say is, my daughter is part of a editorial collective, Frontline Environmental Activists,
Yay.
Line 3 Pipeline Protesters, and they put together this wonderful book. And originally it was published through they raised funds through a foundation, and it was shared in the community. It's stories and art and photography by frontline activists who were protesting Line 3. And so the funds were generated, and it was published to be shared in the community. But the book has been of such interest that Haymarket in Chicago, a good lefty press, has picked it up. And so now it's widely available to anyone. Even the river starts small. And so if you are interested in environmental issues and living history, so you'll forgive me for the shameless plug, but I'm delighted with their success, and with the good work that they're trying to do in our world. So yeah, plug for the kid.
No, that's great. Actually, you and I seem to always be on weirdly similar wavelengths, Brady. I was actually going to ask you about it and encourage you to plug it. So I'm glad you took the initiative there. Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. You know, one of the sessions I went to in Louisville was on experimental autobiography, and it was really interesting. Panel. Obviously, I'm always attracted to experimentalism, and it was supposed to be a 4-person panel, but 2 of the 4 people couldn't make it, so ultimately it was just 2 people. But they read very, very different sort of pieces, but they were both autobiographical. And I bring it up as a segue to the story we're going to talk about because I actually picked this story out weeks and weeks ago because we originally were going to try to tape before all of our busy travel took place, and then that didn't work out. So I actually picked this story before I went to Louisville and went to that panel on experimental autobiography. But serendipitously, this story I think is a great example of experimental autobiography. And so maybe we can kind of drift into our discussion. It's a story that appears in Bennington Review, which is obviously a great literary journal, issue 12, summer 2023, so pretty darn recent. And normally I start with giving kind of a synopsis of the story, and then eventually I kind of parenthetically add a little bit of bio about the author. But I think in this case we might want to start with the bio note. But I will give you the title. I'm not even quite sure how to say it. It's that experimental. I think it's Isisu, nice to Asisiu, ha ha. I don't know if that comes through very well there, but it's by a young woman named Ali Zenworth. And before we get into the story, let me fast forward to Ali's bio. And the contributor's note that appears here in the Bennington Review, if you search for Ali online, you find that she's published several pieces online and that her contributor's note is very consistent with this note. So it's clearly something she, is very comfortable with sharing and kind of putting forward as part of her biographical information. But in this contributor's note specifically, it says, Ali Zenworth escaped from the Hasidic community through the help of others. Her words also appear in Had, Long Reads, and X-Ray. And that's all we get here. But again, if you look her up online, you find several pieces, all of a kind of experimental and all kind of autobiographical bent. That kind of put forward that part of her history. We had talked about, Brady and Grant and I had talked about, obviously this is a potentially kind of touchy subject, and maybe that's putting it mildly in terms of, all of the anti-Semitic tension that is in the air right now and everything that's going on there. And so, this is kind of part of this story, but I really kind of want to focus more on the experimental nature of it anyway. So I don't know how much we're going to get into any of that too much, but I did want to kind of put that out there because it is a part of the story. And so let me just kind of very quickly give a brief synopsis. It's a little bit hard to know what to say because this is pretty experimental, which I love. I know you guys do too, maybe Brady especially. But again, the title is, and again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, Isisu, nice to Asisiu, ha ha. And Isisu is an actual Egyptian princess. She was the daughter of Nefermat, probably not saying that right either, 4th dynasty, 26th century BC. And as the story begins, we find her, Isisu, who has been mummified, and she is a display, an exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History. And
which is a registered copyright.
Registered copyright, yeah, that's another element we want to maybe touch on. And so she wakes up. She comes back to life, as does her dog, Pepe. I'm not sure how to say it. And they escape from the Natural History Museum. I'm not giving much away here. It all happens in the first couple paragraphs of the story. And then she is on the run. And it's an episodic kind of tale, meaning that it's kind of made up of these kind of short vignettes. And the focus isn't totally on her, the Egyptian princess who's come back to life. We're also introduced very quickly to a young woman named Scotty, who is, like the author, escaped from an acidic community, and so there's that sort of autobiographical element coming into play. But Scotty eventually becomes an employee of the hospital where Isisu is sort of under arrest, so to speak. She's under observation, but she's kind of strapped down, and she's got a handcuff on her wrist, and she's being kind of studied like a specimen and not treated like a real human being. And so Scotty and Isisu developed this friendship through the help of technology, being able to translate ancient Egyptian, which, by the way, I don't think actually there is such a thing, but who knows. But anyway, that's kind of the basic plot. But again, from an experimental nature, Brady's already mentioned that oftentimes when a thing, a website, an organization is mentioned, we get the little registered symbol, the little R in a circle symbol after it. Sometimes when someone says something, it's trademarked. We get the little TM symbol. We have various insertions that are sometimes kind of set off as author's note, where the author of this story seems to be speaking to us directly about things that are going on in the story. There's a lot of use of slang in the story. Grant mentioned when we first kind of got together this morning, but before we started recording, that one of the things Allie does is use letters like capital A, capital B, capital C to identify the different sections, which is a little bit unusual. I noticed in another piece that she has online, she does the same sort of thing. So it's obviously a technique that she plays with.
It
So
might be a piece in X-ray or Are You My Mother? That piece I tracked down. I think
okay.
Are You My Mother? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to stop talking. I mean, obviously, I'm just going to, that's sort of the basic idea of the story. I don't know, what are some of your thoughts after having read it probably a couple times now? I know, Grant, you kind of have the screen if you want to go ahead and jump in.
No, I'll hear from Brady first because I know this is more his home run kind of turf.
His wheelhouse.
Yeah, his wheelhouse.
Yeah, well, I can say some things. I really like this story. Of course, and anything experimental, anything constructed of a text constructed of other texts, that immediately appeals to me. I mean, there's a lot going on in this story, and it seems to me a kind of classic short story in that it makes demands immediately of the reader. Grant, we were talking about this a little bit before we went on air, that it's what I like about, one of the things I like very well about this story is it's constantly putting pressure on you to get your bearings, like what is going on. But that's one of the great things about short stories, and why I think maybe some readers would prefer novels to short stories, because you're always having to switch gears. You're always having to get your bearings in a short story collection. You start a short story. Who are these people? What's going on? It's going by fast. You're trying to get your bearings on what's going on, and then it stops. And then you're on to the next story. And it's a lot of work for readers. Like, it puts a lot of pressure on the reader. And this story, I think, all the way throughout, keeps that pressure on, that kind of built-in pressure that is sort of at the experience of the short story. It keeps it on us the whole time. And so not only is it a text made of texts, not only is it funny by times, but it sustains that short story feeling. And so I like that really well. So a million things to say. First things first, I love the dedication. I don't know if it's actually two people or it's part of somehow the story, but before the story begins, there's a dedication. It says, "To Sue for you, to Sarah my mascara." Like, right away, I was already like, I want to know what's, like, this is already cool. I want to, who has a dedication like that. So part of what I like, the textual nature of it, the textness of it, but then the parallel stories, I think it works really well. The difference between the mummy come to life and Scotty's story and how they talk to one another makes it interesting. And so since I'm nattering, I'll just like there's some really great details here. For example, there's a little blurb just after the story opens on the very first page of the story. American Museum of Natural History, meet Isuzu, and then it closes with discarded draft of a New Yorker, and then another one of those insert R's review. And then later on in the story, and this is not to give anything away, but just part of the fun and the intelligence of this story. The typography is interesting. Ted knows that I love. I'm nattering on. You know, there's nothing I like more than a good font and a good changing. But towards the end of the story, in caps in bold, the answer is hidden behind our paywall. Subscribe now. As you know, absolutely killer in this great story. And what I'm not communicating here is, of course, the story's as serious an exploration of human experience as you could want, even as it has these fun and sometimes comedic touches. It's still, you know, the story punches hard. So anyway, I'm nattering on. I apologize. Let me stop.
Well,
No,
go ahead, Grant.
No, I was just because I wanted to listen. I wanted to hear what you had to say, and that was awesome. Because you know, my first read to, I was not, my bearings were like, what the hell is going on here? I'm more old school, you know, more of a modernist. But second time through, I was like, I was grabbed hold of, and enjoying the ride, enjoying the comedy, even the sort of political, the joke about the registered trade, like in our capitalist, like it's just overboard. Like, Brady, did you know? I know you're a hockey guy. Gordie Howe, Mr. Hockey, his nickname is a registered trademark.
Oh man, yeah. Who owns that?
Gordie. Gordie's family. Yeah, I mean, that's just sick as far as so anyway, as I was going through this, it just on the first read I noticed, and after second I just blanked them out because it was slowing down my reading. But like, it's just that kind of a statement. The assassination of the dog just sort of left in the I'm giving things away.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
But left in the gutter by the curb, you know. There's some really, like you were saying, like she is treated like a cadaver, like she's dead but came alive. But the word cadaver appears in the way she's sort of experimented on and objectified. I mean, there's just so much stuff going on in this story, so many layers, and it's I think it's a tour de force. I totally agree with you. And on a second read, I was not just blown away, but I know it's a weird word to use, but I was kind of charmed by the story, and I'm like almost like a spell put over me, and I was just like totally into the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I was going to say, as if there isn't enough going on already, Allie sets the story during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
And so you've also kind of got that inserted here and there about the, you know, the hospital that she goes to work at, not as a nurse, but as a kind of more of an administrative assistant or a data entry kind of person. You know, it's under barrage, and she talks about the heroic efforts of the nurses. And so again, there's all this stuff happening. And even though, like Brady said, it's a short story, but yeah, I think if you started kind of going through and kind of listing all the different issues that the writer brings up and explores to you know, a fairly substantial degree, it might start to look more like a novella or something in terms of the amount of coverage that she's able to get in this story. You know, I kind of come back to that idea of being kind of disoriented and having to kind of get your bearings and all that. You know, this guy, William Gass, one of the things that he talked about.
Okay, wait. Are we really going to talk about? I'm just teasing.
One of the things that he talked about was that that there are some writers who write for what he called the fast mind. And the idea is that the reader can just sort of skim over the surface of the text, get the gist of it, and it'll be fine and move on. And then other writers, postmodernists or whatever word you want to use, they deliberately kind of put up roadblocks or throw spikes in the road or whatever you want to say to make the reader slow down and to make them kind of stop and have to think about the text and maybe reread a sentence before going on and trying to make sense of it. And obviously, a lot of readers don't want to work that hard, which is again something Gass talked about. But a reader who does, presumably, I think they get maybe more out of that reading experience ultimately than somebody who reads something that's so superficial and so easy to read that it just kind of you just kind of slide over the surface of the text. And one of the things like that Gass used to do, which I know is not unique to him, is not use quotation marks. So you use dialogue. So there's all sorts of dialogue happening. This character says this and this character says that, but without quotation marks, it really requires the reader to read carefully and to sometimes have to go back and now who said this and what's the context here, and just something as simple as that can make a big difference in terms of making the reader to slow down. And obviously, Brady, we're working on A Journey to Al Ramel. We've already kind of alluded to it, but it is a book that uses lots of different kinds of writing, journal entries, newspaper clippings, those kinds of things. And so a reader of your book is constantly having to sort of get their bearings. But where are we? Who's the speaker of this text? And where are we in terms of the geography and the chronology of the story? So those are obviously choices you made as a writer. You could have written a text that's easy to slide. And a lot of your short fiction is very readable and doesn't really require that much, bearings seeking for the reader. But your novel is a whole nother animal.
Yeah. I have trepidation. Because I love those kinds of stories. I love stories that put pressure on and that make you pay that kind of attention. That Gass talks about, and I like that the kind of textual nature of books, and as I like in this story. But then it poses such challenges, I think, sometimes to readers. Just as you say, excuse me, in the Journey to Al Ramel, the novel, it's not like I was really at pains to try to make clear who was speaking, but there are so many different voices. It's a kind of polyphonic mix, and they're supposed to blend, right? But it challenges, and so I don't know if it becomes too frustrating. Like at what point, again, a short story, maybe because the person's experience of it's going to be relatively brief, but in a novel, but then the novelists I admire most really put a lot of pressure on the reader. So I don't know. I have trepidation. I have fear.
Well, as you know, we got our blurbs are starting to come in for your novel, and so far, people are just super impressed, and just saying all kinds of wonderful and accurate things, I would say. So early, the read of it is that people are getting it and they're understanding kind of what you're doing and recognizing that it's a complex book, but it's not beyond being comprehensible and being enjoyable and those kinds of things. So I think you should feel good based on what people are starting to say about the book as the some of the proofs have gone out and people have started to get a sense of what your book is about.
Well, thank you, Ted. Yeah, I hope that's so. Just as in this story, one of the things I'm interested in the journey is that how narratives intertwine, and how the stories of different people can become merged, and how they can cross paths, and so I hope, of course, I hope people love it. I guess we'll see.
So far so good.
Yep.
One of the techniques that Allie uses, which I also use, and I suspect Brady you did too, and Grant maybe have in the past, is there's a lot of references to very specific things, whether it's a historical character or whether it's a website or whether it's a product of some sort. And I don't know if you guys had an opportunity to go and kind of look some of those up because some of them I wasn't familiar with, like Isusu herself. Um, and in a lot of cases, in fact, I would say most cases, maybe nearly all, it is an actual thing. It is an actual website, actual organization, an actual this. But at times, then Allie will slip in something that's completely made up. Like, for example, the technology that allows someone to speak to, a 3,000-year-old Egyptian princess with her own language because ancient Egyptian is part of the database that it's using. And I don't think that exists, but because of the fact so much of it is genuine and historical and real, it makes the totally made up stuff even more believable to the point where I think a lot of readers would just, oh, okay, yeah, that's a thing, or whatever. And again, I know in my fiction, which I a lot of it is historically based, a lot of it is accurate, and I've done research and blah blah blah. But that also gives me liberty to slip in stuff that's just completely made up to kind of help the narrative along, or whatever it might be. Whereas if it was all kind of made up, I think it would have a sort of feel of inauthenticity that obviously I want to avoid. So I don't know what about that. This sneaking in wholly fictional stuff. I know. Grant, maybe I'll bop over to you because you've been quiet for a while. You obviously are setting a lot of your stories in real historical places. With real historical events. Shoeshine Kill is very much based on the Soviet Canadian hockey series. And so obviously is very meticulous in terms of the games and the scoring, but yet I suspect there are things that you're also throwing in that are just completely out of your own imagination.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's so interesting you asked that because when I describe the games, everything that I write that happens in the games happen. Like I rewatch the games. I have all 8 games. I watch them every September. It's like a ritual. I even watched this year. I watched them on the day they were played. I mean, game 1 on whatever the date, game 2 on whatever the date, because they were all like they were a couple days apart, and then there was a couple of weeks off, and then a couple of days apart. So late September and early September, the games were played, and so all of that stuff is factual. Some of the comments though that the character makes are my own ideas of rewatching the games and noticing things like Ken Dryden struggling moving side to side because of the way the Soviets move the puck around as opposed to being an angle goalie and stand. So those are things as I rewatched the games I was catching and I start putting in there. And as I rewatched the games, I realized how great Frank Mahovlich was in the first 2 games of that series, even though the numbers weren't necessarily there. He set up so many great plays. He played really well, but he wasn't getting the dividends, in terms of goals and assists. And so I made sure to have a character comment on that. So that was like the daughter, actually, the 4 or 5-year-old daughter comments to her dad about how great he says, who's the best player on the ice? She goes, Mahovlich. And he says, which one? Peter Frank. And she goes, Frank. And it's like, that's my reading going back over the games, looking at it. And Brad Park was amazing in that series and didn't get the credit he deserved initially. So there's a way in which, I mean, Esposito was fantastic. Henderson was fantastic. They're the ones everyone always talks about. But going back over and watching the games carefully, Gary Bergman, Brad Park, Ken Dryden came up big, even though his numbers weren't great.
Bobby Clark.
Bobby Clark, absolutely. Ron Ellis, that whole line was amazing. The Ellis, Clark, Henderson line. So anyway, I'm sorry to go off on a hockey thing here, but my point
Listen,
is,
Grant, never apologize for that, okay?
all right.
Remember, I do have the mute control here.
I guess my point is my comments about the games are my comments. Looking back over the years, but filtering it through Hayden, who was a hockey player. So I figure he's got some authenticity to speak and notice things. And there's one point where somebody in the novel starts talking about, why isn't Dave Keon on the team? And I remember thinking that when I was 12 years old. Why isn't Keon on this team? He's a great player. And but Clark, Clark was if Keon was on the team, Clark probably wouldn't have been. And Clark was such an important player on that team. So Hockey Canada made the right choice. But anyway, yeah. So Ted, absolutely. That is something I do. And you guys were talking about, different voices and all that. And one of the things, and I know I've talked about some other broadcasts that we've done podcasts, but I'm a big fan of uncertainty when it comes to the mystery novel. And so I do a lot of stuff with summary and free and direct discourse, because I don't want to have direct quote marks all the time, because I don't want what's being said to be accurate. I mean, I am deliberately messing with people's minds because I want them to wonder, is that exactly is that true? And that's just sort of a technique I like to use, because we're in the world of mystery, and mystery should be mysterious and strange and troubling and uncertain. So that's just kind of a technique I've stolen from Jane Austen and other writers that I admire. But yeah, I do that all the time, play with history. I want to get it right to a certain point, and then I want to be able to mess around with it and do some, different things with it.
Brady, what's
Wow,
your
Grant.
sense of that too?
Sorry, I just want to say we should do a whole podcast on free and direct discourse and the advantages and what that amazing technique yields. I mean, if anything that we ever say appeals to young writers or might be of use to somebody, free and direct discourse, do that. Sorry, Ted, I cut you off.
Well, I was just going to ask, in your work, particularly your novel that we're working on, A Journey to Al Ramel, how did you mix, real historical, facts with your own imagination and so forth?
Oh yeah, no, I did a ton of research, and so yeah, just as Grant says, like there's a lot in A Journey to Al Ramel that is based in history, but what has been preeminent in my mind in thinking about that novel, and what I would say to somebody if they ever asked me, is that the characters in my novel that look like and share names with people who actually walk the earth, my characters are not those people. There are things about their lives and about their experiences that I definitely wanted to explore, and that the novel brings in, but it's not history. It's not meant to be confused with history. I mean, there's crazy things going on in my novel. That's just kind of how it goes. So I like that tension. It's a little bit different and also analogous to what Grant's describing. Yeah, based in history, but then it's a novel. It's what I want to explore. It's what I want to talk about. And so it's not history. It's based in history, but it's not history. And those people I already said, but those, for example, D.H. Lawrence is a character in A Journey to Al Ramel. Somebody called D.H. Lawrence, somebody called Bertie Lawrence, but it is not D.H. Lawrence, the author, the astonishingly productive and incredibly great, I think, short story and novella writer. Less certain about his novels. He's not the person walking through the book. He has some things in common with the guy who walked the earth, but they're different folks too. So it's a tension when I try to exploit.
One of my early books, in fact, I think it ended up being like the second kind of full length. It's a novella. It's 37,000 words. I mean, it's for sure a novella, but it took me 3 or 4 years to write. But it's a sort of fictionalized biography of Herman Melville, and it's called Weeping with an Ancient God, and it's about his experience as a young sailor when he jumped ship and ended up on an island with an indigenous group that practiced cannibalism, and obviously he eventually got back to the U.S. and then he wrote about that experience in his novel Typee, which is a thinly veiled kind of autobiographical novel. But anyway, when I wrote that book, I tried to be very true to Melville's experiences and his biography, and I didn't take a lot of liberties. I mean, obviously, I didn't know, it's not in the records like what he was thinking at the time of this event or that event. So I invented his internal monologue and that kind of thing. But it was very hard, narratively, because real life doesn't really fit a nice narrative arc, very often, which is why biopic, pictures oftentimes are kind of disappointing because, they don't, if they're trying to follow real life doesn't offer a lot of satisfying endings very often. So fast forward a little later, I wrote a book, An Untimely Frost, and I wanted it to be based on the rumored romantic relationship between Mary Shelley and Washington Irving. But when I started that, because of my experience writing Weeping with an Ancient God, I wasn't going to tie myself that closely to biography. So I kind of changed the names of the characters, and I just played very fast and loose. If there was something about Mary Shelley's biography that worked for me that I liked, I threw it in. If there was something I just wanted to make up completely or change a little bit, I did that. And creatively, it was a much more satisfying writing experience than trying to write this strictly sort of biographical, even though it was fiction or whatever. And I've kind of gone back to that now. As I've mentioned before, my new project is to take one of the minor characters from that book, who I modeled after Edgar Allan Poe, and now he's the main character of this new work. I've just been having a load of fun using actual Poe texts and Poe biographical detail, but then just making whole stuff up also. So, Brady, I kind of see you nodding vigorously there. I take it you're familiar with that true but not quite true approach.
No, I love it. And I think we have a school. We're going to have to bring Grant in. We're going to, the 12 Winters School of blending that biography and history, and then reshaping things to tell the kinds of stories that we want to tell. We want that freedom. We want to follow our own voice. We want to tell the stories that we want to tell. And so if biography doesn't fit, well, we're not obliged. The nice thing about fiction is we're not obliged to stick to the facts.
Right.
Although Grant is.
No, well, I do like sticking to facts to a certain extent, but for example, Jean Beliveau is a character in my short story, Shot Reverse Shot. He makes an appearance, he talks, and it's all made up. But I read a couple biographies on Jean Beliveau. Even though I'm a Leafs fan, I'm a big admirer of Le Gros Bill, and so I tried to be truthful to what I've read about Beliveau. At the same time, I gave myself liberty to go wherever I felt was important for the story, right? And if I feel like I'm being nasty about somebody, then I will change the name. So like in the whole series, like in Cheap Amusements, Foster Hewitt, who was the voice of the Toronto Maple Leafs on radio, I call him, I think, McClellan Stewart, which is a joke on the Canadian publisher, McClellan Stewart. Yeah, I changed the name. Stewart spelled it differently. But it was also because the character, has done some nefarious things. And so I didn't want to blemish Mr. Hewitt by actually using his name. Similarly, I'm not a big fan of Punch Imlach. I think he was an asshole. I think he treated Mahavlich poorly. So rather than put that on paper and get into trouble with the Imlach estate,
Instead, you put it in our podcast sponsored by 12 Winters Press. Thanks a lot.
And, I hadn't thought about that, but there's other people that have said meaner things. But I just think he was terrible to Frank Mahavlich, and so in my novels, I think his name's Two-Fisted Farrell, which is actually the name of a character in G-Men, which was Cagney's instructor when he goes to work for the FBI. But anyway, it's a little shout out to Warner Brothers. But I just thought, well, I don't want to call him Punch Imlach because I'm not too praiseworthy of this man, so I'm going to change the name. But other characters, I use their real names when I feel I'm being fair to them. I met Tony Kushner. He came to our school, and I got talking to him about the Honeymooners because I love Jackie Gleason, and I'm a big fan of Audrey Meadows. I think she's fantastic, and Art Carney, the big three, out of the four. Joyce Randolph's okay. I call her Joyce also Randolph. But anyway, talking, about the Honeymooners, and I was writing a short story at the time, and I said, how true do I have to be? And he says, you don't have, as long as you can imagine probabilities all you want. You're a writer. He says the only thing is don't accuse Jackie Gleason of something that's not fair. Like don't call him a pedophile because there's no record of that. I said, yeah, I wouldn't do that anyway. He says, yeah, but I'm just saying, Grant, you can make stuff up because Lincoln was just coming out and he was talking about with Lincoln, he was true to the historical record, but he had to imagine dialogue. Like there's no record of so he called it imagined probabilities. And I really like that term, and I feel comfortable using that when I use historical figures. So I try to be truthful to a certain extent, but the power of the imagination, we can go where we want to go,
Right. Yeah, I want to. We're probably getting close to a time we want to think about signing off here for the.
Oh my God, it's a long one today, folks.
Let our listeners get on with their lives. But I did want to make one last kind of comment about Ali Zenworth's story. I was very much reminded of one of my favorite short novels, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. In that, in Slaughterhouse-Five, as probably a lot of people know, because it's such a widely read book, you've got Kurt Vonnegut, who on the one hand is telling a pretty accurate autobiographical tale of his experience in Dresden during being a prisoner of war during World War II. But then he also has these flights of fancy where Billy Pilgrim, this fictional character, is abducted by aliens and has this whole kind of adventure thing going on. But clearly, well, it seems clear that Billy Pilgrim is a sort of representation of Vonnegut. And through the trauma that Vonnegut experienced, he's sort of working it out and projecting it through, Billy Pilgrim. So while Vonnegut was a prisoner of the Nazis, Billy Pilgrim was a prisoner of the Tralfamadorians. I mean, so there's all this stuff. And I think Ali is doing something pretty similar here. I think Scotty, the character Scotty, is probably pretty close. I'm just guessing based on autobiographical stuff that we can find online and so forth. But, I'm guessing that Scotty is pretty close in a lot of ways to the author herself. And then Isisu, the Egyptian princess come back to life, is a sort of projection of Ali's persona, her, based on her traumatic experiences and so forth. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there as a really cool way to deal with biography or autobiography. I think to both kind of like having your cake and eating it too. You're both dealing with your own real life narrative, but you're also playing off of a fictional invention kind of simultaneously.
Yeah, and there's a doubling in the narrative, like just as you're explaining, Ted, like both the stories sort of parallel each other. One, they're very similar in some, and there was even a point in the narrative, at least on the first read, I was reading a section and I thought I was reading the Egyptian mummified princess's story, but it was actually Scotty. And I was like, oh my gosh, I got confused there because there's something kind of similar parallel going on, this need to escape. And so anyway, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, Brady, any thoughts on that kind of parallel?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think as a technique, a strategy, it works. Yeah, it works very well. And that experience that Grant has, I mean, you really have to pay attention to keep them separated, right? It's the same story twice in some ways. So yeah, I think, yeah, it's so definitely handled in this story. To Sarah, my mascara.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was great talking to you guys. It took us a while to get together for February, but I'm glad we were able to. Grant's got a Zoom reading coming up in March. He and JD, Jeremy Schraffenberger, both have books out, and so we're going to do kind of a double-barreled reading. Next couple of weeks, we got to work out the fine details on that. And Brady, we've got you and I got to do some serious work on Journey to Al Ramel. Now that you've got some of your academic writing sent off to the editor that was harassing you, and so anyway, we've got a lot of stuff happening. But I think we had a good talk here, and I don't know. I'll just turn it over to you. Just any final thoughts before I hit the stop record button?
Well, I don't know how our auditors or viewers find it, but for me, this is so much fun, and we are eclectic thinkers. We cover a lot of ground, from AI to a story to the relationship between history and fiction, and yeah, fun. Always glad to hang out.
Yeah, I had a blast. This is way more fun than AWP, baby. That's all I got to say.
All right, well, we'll let that be the last word. So hopefully we'll find some time a little more easily in March to get together. But thanks, guys, and I will talk to you guys later. Thanks, listeners and viewers, for following along.